Okay, welcome. Today I'm going to show you how to do a shift spring upgrade in your Toyota 86, your BRZ, Scion FRS, GT86, manual transmission only, obviously, and works on all years, so from release up to the current models. Why would you want to do this upgrade? Okay, so the upgraded springs remove the bit of play that's in your gear shift and also firms up the action right through the gate of your manual transmission. So you'll have much firmer shifts between gears, and also you'll reduce the risk of missing gears, especially especially dangerous on a downshift, say from fifth to fourth, where you miss fourth and go down into second. So have a read of the forums. There's a lot of info around doing this upgrade, and I haven't seen anyone who says that it's a bad thing, so that's why I'm going to give it a crack. I've got my shifter springs from MTEC Industries in the States. I bought these off eBay from their eBay store. They're about $75 to $80 Australian delivered, and that depends on the exchange rate, of course. They're not cheap, but yeah, like I said, everyone's raving about how good an upgrade this is. MTEC were really good as well. I got these in about 10 days, which is phenomenal. Generally, you're flat out getting Australian stores to pack the bloody things in 10 days rather than get them to you. So, okay, so that's what we're going to be doing today, and I'll also provide a bit of a warning. So the main issues that people have in doing this upgrade is getting the 27mm bolt back in to the gearbox without cross-threading it. So we'll talk a bit about that and how you can go about avoiding that throughout the video. So let's have a look at the tools we're going to need. Okay, so you're going to need a 10mm Allen key, and I'll just put the ruler on that. So this is probably about 50mm, or not quite 2 inches across there. Sorry, I'll put the camera on that so you can actually see what I'm doing. And that I've found is just enough to fit in there. If it was any longer, it'd be a bit of a struggle. Okay, you're also going to need a 27mm half-inch drive deep socket. I'll show you why the deep's better when we get into the car. I've also got a 27mm standard socket here with a knuckle on it. Not ideal, and yeah, like I said, for obvious reasons, you'll see why that's not a good idea later on. You'll need a breaker bar, standard half-inch drive, torque wrench, a 10mm hex. Grab a power drill if you've got one. That's just to get that under tray off using that 10mm bit there. Some brake cleaner, some acetone. This is to clean up the thread locker that they have on the bolts that go into the gearbox that hold those compression springs in. Some degreaser and some water just to clean the degreaser up. I've also got an Oki strap here as well. The theory behind that is I've read that if you hold the gear lever to one side when you're working on getting the compression springs back in, makes it a lot easier. So I'll show you that when we go through, and a bit of rag as well. Okay, let's have a look at a bit of theory. Okay, so this is a page out of the workshop manual. I'll link in the description where you can get a copy of this manual for nothing. So this is the gearbox. The front of the car is this way, so we're looking at the back of the gearbox here. There's two compression springs. There's one here and one over here. This one is on the passenger side in the right-hand drive versions of this vehicle. So obviously on the left-hand drive it's on the driver's side. So I'm working on a right-hand drive Australian version, so if you're in the US, you're obviously going to have a left-hand drive, and this will be on the driver's side. So that's the 10mm hex there, and this is the 27mm socket that's on the driver's side. Torque specs are listed here. So I've got Newton meters, kilograms per centimetre, I think. I don't know much about that one. And this one here is pound feet. So we're working in pound feet here. So our torque specs, when we tighten these back up, 18 foot-pounds or pound feet, however you want to say it. And this one over here is 29. So you can see the location of these here. I don't have a view that shows where this one goes into the gearbox here, but we'll see that once we get underneath the car. So that's what we're working on here. We're working to remove this compression spring right here and this one here, and we're going to replace those with the MTEC ones. Cusco also makes some, but yeah, I haven't seen any info on how good they are, so yeah, I've just gone with the MTEC one, which everyone raves about. Okay, so let's get under the car. Okay, so we're under the car. Front of the car's that way. So you've got the aluminium guard at the front, and then you've got this sort of composite, plastic composite guard at the back. So this guard here covers your gearbox. So this is the only one we need to remove. So you'll see that there's some larger screws holding the aluminium one. The ones we need to undo are the 10mm ones, so that's where we need our little 10mm socket in our drill. I've already removed most of these, so if you remove the ones from the front and then work towards the back, that'll make it easier, because the front of this guard is actually sitting on top of the aluminium one, so it won't fall down. So work from the front, go to the back, and then that just drops down. I'll just take this last one out here. So once you've got all the screws out, just drop down and then pull it towards you, and then that should fall away, and then you'll have clear access up to your gearbox where you need to be working. Okay, so this is a gearbox here, and then if you go back to, and I'll just get back a little bit so you can see that. So that's the rear support for the gearbox, just there. So the 10mm hex that we're interested in is just up here. I don't know whether you can see that properly, or try and get some a bit more light on the subject. So that's it there. So that's the one we're interested on the passenger side of this vehicle. And then over on the other side, I'll just get around the other side and we can have a look and see if we can see that. Yeah, there it is there. I don't know whether that's focusing on it properly there, but that's the 27mm bolt that we need to undo to get to the compression spring that's on the driver's side of this vehicle. So, right, well, what I'll do is I'll grab the 10mm hex, and we'll start on the passenger side and remove that and replace that compression spring. So while we're doing that, the vehicle is in neutral. Okay, so I don't know how well you'll be able to see any of this, but I'll try and get this tool into the 10mm hex bolt there. So that's in there now, and that's hard up against this guard here. So you can see why it's fairly important to make sure that you don't have an Allen key that's longer than about 50mm. So I'll go ahead and unscrew that. So lefty loosey, righty tighty, and we'll be back once I've got that out there. Okay, so I've got that loose, and it's out so far that I can't get the Allen key back in there to undo it any further, and it's not quite finger tight that I can unloosen it. So I've just grabbed a pair of multi-grips, and I'm just going to undo that right out of there now. So you can see the amount of thread locker that's on there. That's that white stuff, so there's a fair bit on that bolt. And I've just used the multi-grips on it, and it turns really easily. Just not enough to be finger tight. So I'll get that all the way out, and we'll have a look at getting the compression spring out. Okay, so I only needed a couple of turns with those multi-grips, and then I was able to just get that out by hand. So that's the plug with the 10mm hex, and you can see all that thread locker on there. So we're going to clean that up in a sec. Okay, so getting the compression spring out of there, I've got to tell you when we're looking at what tools you might need. To get that out, you can use a magnet, pick tool, or a thin gauge piece of wire. I'm just going to use a magnet that I've pulled out of a hard drive, and we should be able to get that spring out fairly quickly. Just get up there and get that. So yeah, that's the spring, just pops straight out of there. Okay, we'll go over onto the bench. Okay, so that's the factory compression spring that's come out of the gearbox. So we need to grab our kit, and that's obviously the spring we need to throw in there, so we'll get that right out of the way so we don't get that mixed up. And we'll grab our upgrade spring, just clean the bolt off, and all of this thread locker, we need to get as much of that off as possible. So I'm going to use some acetone. If that doesn't work, I'll use some brake cleaner, or vice versa, and see how we go. Worst comes to worst, I'll just get a wire brush and get that off. I'm also going to do, or attempt to do, the same thing with a bit of rag on the gearbox as well, and see if I can get as much thread locker out of that as possible. So we want to be able to thread this in as far as we can by hand before we put an Allen key back on it. So that'll minimise the risk of cross-threading that. Putting it in by hand, you'll know that it's binding. You'll be able to back it off and get it back in properly without cross-threading it and buggering your day. I don't think we'll need to pull the gear lever towards the passenger side, because that spring wasn't under any compression, so we had to use a magnet to get it out of there. So that should go back in a fair way, hopefully, once that bolt goes in. But if we meet with any resistance, I'll grab the jockey strap and pull that gear lever towards the passenger side, which is the side we're working on, and that should relieve any tension on that compression spring. So okay, so I'll go ahead and get that cleaned up, and do the same underneath the car, clean as much thread locker off as we can. Then we can pop that spring back in the gearbox and get that bolt back in, and we should be done on the passenger side. Okay, so brake cleaner seems to be doing the job. So I've just sprayed a bit of brake cleaner on there, thrown a pair of nitrile gloves, and can't find my small wire brush, so I've just been using this little wire wheel and just cleaning the threads on that bolt there. So it looks like I've pretty much got all of the thread locker out of there. So I'll just put a bit of brake cleaner on a rag, and I'll get under the car and clean as much out of that hole that the spring pops back into as I can. What I'll also do is I'll just thread this in without having the compression spring in at the moment, and just see if I can, how far I can get that in by hand, and that'll help clean some of the thread out as well on the inside and of the gearbox and on this bolt here. So I'll go ahead and do that. Go back under the car and we'll slot the compression spring back in the passenger side of the gearbox, and we'll get that bolt in and we should be done on that side. Okay, so I'll get into that. Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention at the start, you're going to need to get your car up off the ground, obviously. Make sure you do it safely. If you're using jack stands only, make sure you keep your jack under there as well, and throw a spare wheel or two underneath as well, because you don't want the thing coming down on you, because I suspect that once we get to the driver's side and get onto the 27mm bolt, we're probably going to need a fair bit of force on that breaker bar to get that loose. So you don't want to be rocking your car off your jacks or your jack stands. So yeah, and if you're doing this by yourself, it's especially important to make sure that you've got multiple points of failure. Righto, we'll get the spring into the car. Okay, so we'll just get our upgraded spring and we'll just pop that in to the gearbox there. I might need two hands to do this, or the other hand, but anyway, we'll just see how we go. Right, that's in there now. So that just pops in there, and we'll grab our bolt. Now, this is the important bit. You want to get this in as far as you can by hand. So as long as you're getting, you know, a turn or two before you need to get your Allen key back onto this, you should be okay. So I've got that in by quite a few threads there now. So that's firm, pushing against the spring obviously now, so, or just getting tighter because it's got more thread into the gearbox. So I'll start getting my Allen key onto that and tighten that up. This needs to be torqued to 18 pound-foot, but we're not going to be able to get a torque wrench in there due to the space that's available. And I've got a 10mm hex bit for that 1/2-inch drive on the torque wrench, but there's not enough room between the transmission tunnel and the gearbox to get it in there. So we're just going to have to go by feel on that. So, okay, well, I'll get that tightened up, and then we'll move on to the driver's side. Okay, so that passenger side is done now. You will have a bit of oil that's leaked out of there where that compression spring goes, so just get your degreaser and get rid of that. Right, driver's side. Righto, so we're on the driver's side now, and I'll just grab those sockets. So that's the bolt that we need to remove, just there. The one looks like it's got a nipple on the end of it. So it's not horizontal in the gearbox. So it's not sort of sitting like that, it's on an angle down like that. So just remember that when you're putting a socket on it. The reason why you need a deep socket is that once that goes on there, you can then get the breaker bar on, and I don't know whether you can see it because of the exhaust, but the housing for the gearbox actually comes back this way a little bit. So if you have a deep socket, you'll be able to get the breaker bar on to clear the gearbox, so you can use that breaker bar effectively. If you don't have a deep socket and you've only got a knuckle, my knuckle extends out a bit further than the length of the deep socket, so you've got less clearance. And also when you're using a breaker bar, I don't think it's a good idea to have a knuckle that's flexing around. So I picked that up from Super Cheap Auto for 14 bucks, so should make life a lot easier. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll get that socket on there and get the breaker bar, and we'll break that loose. So that's bolt there is going to have thread locker on it as well, and it's torqued down a bit further than the hex plug that we had on the passenger side of the gearbox. So it'll require a bit more effort. So, okay, all right, well, I'll get that done and get that loose, and then we should be able to pull the breaker bar out and just use the normal 1/2-inch drive to get that out completely. So I'll get that done. Okay, a bit of an update. So that's been broken loose, and I've swapped over to the standard 27mm socket. I'm just finding that I've got a bit of interference as that bolt comes out using a standard 1/2-inch drive, so I've dropped back to the breaker bar as well. It's got that flexible tip on it, so that's making it a lot easier to get that bolt out. So I'll continue working on that, and once I've got that loose, we'll have a look at that compression spring assembly that comes out once that bolt's released. Righto, we've got it out finally. It's fiddly more than anything, so yeah, you just have to muck around with the tools you've got to get that out. So once you get that started with the breaker bar, it's fairly easy in terms of effort, but yeah, like I said, just maneuvering your way around in there to get sockets on it to get that out is the hard bit. So as you can see, this one here is also covered in thread locker. So we'll go over to the bench, we'll take this thing apart, and we'll get that thread locker cleaned up and get that compression spring replaced and get it reinstalled. Okay, so this is the driver's side compression spring housing out of the gearbox. So that just pops apart like that, and inside there you'll just see that spring. So we'll pull that out, tuck that over there with the other one, and we can get our upgraded one, and that'll just slot in there like that. So once again, we're going to use some acetone and some brake cleaner to get in and clean as much of that thread locker off of that as possible. Then we're going to get the rag dipped in acetone and get into the gearbox housing and clean as much of the thread locker out of there as we can as well. So I won't put this back together straight away. So what I'll do is I'll clean the oil off of that first, but I'll just use this without the spring in place and thread that in by hand into the gearbox. So we're loosening some more of that thread locker out of there, and we're making sure that we can hand thread that in fairly easily. So when we go to put this back in, we know that we're able to get it in a fair way by hand until we put a tool on it. So this is the most critical part of this operation, because according to the forums, a lot of people, this is where they have a disaster when they're putting this compression spring back in. They're cross-threading this housing once it goes back into the gearbox, and obviously that's not something you want to do, because then you'll have to get your car towed or drive it to a mechanic and get someone to rethread your gearbox so you can get that back in there. So it's important that we clear as much of this thread locker off as we can, and then we guide this in by hand without that compression spring in, just so we can make sure that we're able to clean some of the threads in the gearbox as this goes in. And then once we're ready to go, we'll put the new upgraded compression spring into this housing, pop it back together. Okay, so we'll get that cleaned up, and then we'll get it back together and get it back in that gearbox. Okay, so I've got that started by hand. Now, whoever posted on YouTube on FT86 Speed Factory's YouTube channel that you pull the gear lever to the side that you're working on is full of shit, because yeah, I couldn't get that bolt started properly with the gear lever pulled towards the side you're working. So I've just put it back in neutral, and I can hand thread that in there, probably 2 or 3 threads now. So yeah, disregard that bit of advice because that's bullshit. So anyway, live and learn. So I've got that started now. So I'll go ahead and put a socket on it and start tightening that up. And then I'll get that tightened up to the point where I can get a torque wrench on it and torque it up to 29 foot-pound. Alright, I'll get that done and we'll be back. Okay, a bit of a tip when you get this bolt, or you want to start getting this bolt started back into that hole by hand, is just turn it to the left as if you're loosening it, and then you'll feel it kind of seat properly against the face of the thread that it needs to go in, and then you can just turn it clockwise to tighten it, right turn to tighten that up, then tighten that up as far as you can using your fingers, and then grab your socket and just use your socket by hand to continue to tighten that up, so that way you'll feel it bind if you're cross-threading it. But chances are, like if you've got it hand tightened quite a few threads, which I have now, you shouldn't have a problem cross-threading this. So yeah, start off by hand, then just use a socket without a half-inch drive on it, and get that tightened up as much as you can, and then you can just put the half-inch drive or the breaker bar back on it to start getting it tightened up to the point where you can use your torque wrench. So the point is, just be careful, take your time. If you feel something isn't right, just back it off and start again. And if you need to clean the threads even more, take the time to do that, because you don't want to cross thread this bolt when you're putting it back in. But yeah, if you take your time and you're patient, you'll be okay. Okay, so I've got that tightened up and torqued to spec, so pretty much ready to go there now, and I've jumped in the car and tested it, and yeah, it's good. It's a lot firmer. There's no play left in the gear shift, and it feels good. I can see why people rave about it. Right, let's do a bit of a recap on the tools that we ended up using. So yeah, I said you're only going to need a deep socket, but I used both of those. So get a deep and a standard 27mm socket. Get a half-inch drive extension bar. You may need to use that when you're fiddling around trying to get the driver's side 27mm compression spring housing out. Grab a knuckle as well, comes in handy. Your half-inch drive. Also a pair of multi-grips as well, came in handy. And that's pretty much it. So I'll jump under the car and just hit it with some degreaser, because there is a bit of gearbox oil, I assume it's gearbox oil, comes out of those compression spring housings when you pull them out. So I'll just clean that up. Ocky strap, and the other thing we used was our nitrile gloves, just to keep our hands clean. So that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching. As I said, it's a fiddly job, but you can do it yourself. Just take your time, be careful, and make sure that you clean as much as that thread locker off as you can before you reinstall those bolts. Do them up by hand as far as you can, and yeah, you should be okay. So anyway, worthwhile upgrade, thoroughly recommend it. I've just ordered the clutch spring from MTEC Industries, so once I get that, I'll put the upgraded clutch spring in this car and I'll do the video on that. So that'll be good, because this is a right-hand drive vehicle, and it's a lot more involved putting that clutch spring in. So anyway, thanks for watching.